Hello, I'm Jess Thom. I'm an artist, writer and part-time superhero. Biscuit, I also have Tourette's syndrome, which means I make movements and noises I can't control called tics. I'm a white woman who is 40 years old with short curly brown hair and a very cool wheelchair. Biscuit, hedgehog, cat.
Hi everybody, I'm Louise. I'm a smiley white woman with brown shoulder length hair and a short fringe. I'm BOM's curator and I'm neurotypical.
Hedgehog, sausage.
Hi everybody, my name is Kruse. I'm a neurodivergent artist. I'm a white woman with red hair and I'm 56 years old.
Sausage.
I'm an autism advocate and a current BOM Fellow. And I believe that there's a lot of highly talented neurodivergent creative practitioners out there whose beautiful brains can create interesting work, but whose untypical way of seeing the world or experiencing the world can make it hard to navigate a successful career in the arts. And in this series, through conversations with other neurodivergent artists, I'm going to discuss some of the common barriers that we face and explore practical ways arts organisations can make their operations and their spaces actively welcoming and supportive to neurodivergent people. So yes, today I am joined by Jess Thom, aka the Tourettes Hero, and thank you very much for joining us today, Jess. In a few words, can you tell us some more about what you do, your creative practice?
Biscuit. So Tourettes Hero is a creative organisation and a superhero persona. I founded it a decade ago in collaboration with co-founder Matthew Pountney. We wanted to use Tourette's as a springboard for ours and other people's creativity and create an organisation that reclaimed the laughter associated with Tourette's and created an organisation that was drawing attention, Biscuit, to some of the invisible barriers in our cultural spaces. So Tourette's Hero is about humour, it's about creativity, we work across art forms and we're very collaborative. Biscuit, sausage, cats.
That's wonderful. I really enjoyed looking at your work online and seeing some of the talks that you've given and also some of the I guess performances that you've given as well, where you've maybe been going into schools or working in community or yeah, and I also particularly love the spaceship video that you ran, I guess with your co-collaborators on YouTube. Can you just say a little bit about that video?
Biscuit. So I am in the clinically extremely vulnerable group for COVID-19, and so we have been shielding in London since March, and I was very lucky to have a crew of people who were supporting me to do that and who were keeping me safe, and that we started talking about ourselves and the whole situation of COVID as being like space travel, that we were sort of in our spaceship flung on an unexpected journey. Biscuit. We were asked by James Ledbetter, aka the vacuum cleaner, who is an amazing neurodivergent artist, to contribute to a online festival, and so we decided to make a spoof of Star Trek about our spaceship and about the sort of unexpected journey that we had to go on, and the fact that Biscuit, actually disabled people have been navigating the sort of space of isolation and sudden change and needing to do things in different ways for generations. And there's an amazing writer in the States called Alice Wong who talks about disabled people as oracles for now, and I think that there's a lot of truth in that actually that the lived experience of disabled neurodivergent people has and had a lot to teach people about navigating a sort of very sudden change. Biscuit, what feels exciting to me about like what COVID has revealed is that everything that we think of as fixed and permanent and the way things have to be done, was very quickly revealed to not be permanent. It can be changed like overnight, Biscuit, when it was seen as in the requirements of everybody, predominantly non-disabled people. So if we can change systems and structures so quickly, why can't we do that when that's relating to access and to accommodate and shape a world that works for a diversity of bodies and brains? So in some ways, what's happened over the last few months, Biscuit, has made me feel really frustrated, and in other ways it makes me feel excited and optimistic to actually, it's going to be very hard for organizations, Biscuit, and institutions now, I think, to say that that has to be the way that we do it, because actually we've proved that those things like aren't fixed and unchanging. Biscuit, sausage.
I think that's really interesting, because one of the questions that I really wanted to ask in this series, and that I kind of wanted to ask of you as well, was this idea that we perhaps make organizations really uncomfortable. I've done some work with organizations looking at neurodivergent access and so on. One of the questions that comes up a lot is what happens if someone has a meltdown. You know, and it seems to me that there's like a kind of an underlying anxiousness or fear about how a neurodivergent person might behave in a given space. And I think that makes organizations uncomfortable and a little fearful, which makes me quite cross, because it proves how little we are actually out in the world, and out in all its connotations there, I think. So I want to ask you, that's the first question I wanted to ask you really, is do you think we make organizations uncomfortable?
The simple answer is probably yes, but I think it's more new. I think the reason that we make, or that neurodiversity makes organizations uncomfortable, is because neurodivergent people don't necessarily value and prioritize the same rules as neurotypical people. So I think that there's this idea that if you relax any of the rules, particularly around cultural space and behavior, that there's anarchy. In my experience, there isn't anarchy, there's inclusivity. And it's funny that what you say about organizations being very focused on sort of meltdowns, although the ideas around that. Firstly, it says that it feels to me like there's little understanding of what might cause people to need to respond like that, and that actually that's a failure of access that will often lead to that situation. It's not thinking about how stimulating the environment is, or communicating that clearly so people can make choices about what's comfortable to them. It's about like assuming that everyone can interact and is comfortable doing that in the same way, and putting pressure on people to conform in particular ways. It also is weird, because I know that Biscuit organisations, and particularly theatres and arts venues, deal with lots of very unusual behaviour. It's like they will definitely be ready to handle hen parties, or people who've got drunk, or kids like that. What they find difficult is the idea that behaviour might be happening, or things that they might interpret in one way might be happening for different reasons. And I think that fundamentally that fear of the unknown is what causes barriers. And fear is a big barrier, and fear was a big barrier within my life. So I think it's important as neurodivergent people that we address our own fears and assumptions about how people will respond to us, and our own expectations when it comes to meeting our access requirements. But it's also important that we try and work with organisations in creative, playful ways to try and break down some of their fears. And I think 2019 felt fundamentally like a really interesting year in terms of risk and fear. That's probably just changed again now, but last year was interesting because there were a number of high-profile arts commissions where access hadn't been thought about. It wasn't an integral part of the brief. And those, so the Peterloo Memorial and an exhibition at Tate Modern, both of which then had non-accessible structures created, non-accessible art pieces of art. And that whereas even 5 years ago, there would have been a tolerance for that, and the idea that, well, that's the fault of disabled people for having broken bodies. it was interesting that actually the risk felt like it landed the other way, and that those organizations were called out on creating non-accessible, exclusionary pieces of art. So I think that there was some shift, and that hopefully there's a bit of a carrot and a stick thing. Firstly, I think that organizations are missing out on the huge talent and creative energy and innovation of neurodivergent and disabled people. But I also think that they are risking exposing themselves to reputational risk and being left behind, and in an increasing in an environment where I think there is increasingly an idea that it's not the fault of our bodies or brains if we are being excluded from spaces. They are sets of decisions that are being upheld by the sort of gatekeepers and people in power of those spaces. It's not the natural order that disabled neurodivergent people are excluded. It's a set of decisions we're all upholding and maintaining. And I think the more we can sort of call that out loudly and proudly, the faster we'll be able to create real change. Biscuit.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's a very exciting time, because it isn't just about the conversation around, I mean, for our purposes right now, the conversation is around neurodivergency, but I feel very strongly that I'm part of that wider conversation that's saying, well, what is a typical human? Typical human isn't a white guy or a white woman like myself, bit middle class, you know? Who are the typical humans out there? Well, we all are. And this conversation, the conversations that are currently happening around gender, around Black Lives Matter, around disability access, it's part of I think, a really wonderful and exciting movement of human beings saying, we all look like this. We come in all these different shapes and sizes and colors and genders, and, you know, things that we can do and things that we can't do. And really, and I'm sure the internet has had a lot to do with that. The fact that people do run their own kind of like, you know, YouTube channels and are able to put their faces out into the world. Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time, and I definitely feel part of a movement of change that is exciting.
I think the first thing to say is that, so I identify as a disabled person within a concept of thinking called the social model of disability. So the social model gets away from traditional medical or charity ways of thinking about disability, and the social model was created by disabled people like decades ago, and it's sort of widely understood amongst lots of people, but like in sort of organizations or within like disabled led sector, but isn't something that has really become embedded within the sort of cultural norms that we definitely still, the medical and charity model, are sort of clinging on. And the difference is that both the medical and charity model see someone as disabled because of the impairment they have, because their bodies or mind is broken in some way and therefore is in need of cure or pity or fixing. The social model, by contrast, acknowledges that it's normal for people to have bodies and minds that vary and that work in different ways. What disables people is our collective failure to make and shape a world that works for a diversity of bodies and minds. So it's not my tics that are inherently disabling about me. They are my impairment. They're a fact about my body, and that has challenges. But what is disabling, and why I say I'm a disabled person, is because I experience barriers in the world because of non-accessible environments, systems, and attitudes. And the exciting thing about that for me is that by thinking and considering a diversity of bodies and minds, whenever we're making something new or setting something up, whether that's creating a piece of art or laying out the chairs in a cafe, we can create less disabling spaces. And that's not to deny impairment. The sort of differences and facts about our body are what they are, but the lived experience of barriers is something that can and should be changed. The art, culture, academic thinking that comes out of that lived experience of barriers is rich and powerful and exciting to me, and that's why what I would call disability culture. So for me, when I say I'm a disabled person, that's not diminishing me in any way. It's acknowledging the barriers I face because of a collective failure to consider difference. And I think the social model is applicable to lots of areas of life that go beyond disability, and that people might be marginalized for very varied reasons. And I think it's important not to conflate those experiences because they are nuanced and different and have different histories. But I think it is important to act in solidarity with each other and to understand that the experience of it being excluded can often feel similar, even if the reason why that's happening is very different and has different connotations or roots. And I'm like increasingly sort of talk about a sort of normative supremacy. So the idea that we shape a world for this normative body or mind that doesn't really exist, and that our minds and bodies aren't static. They aren't just non-disabled and stay that way forever. Even as a disabled person, I have to go through the process of understanding and accepting my body as it changes. Interestingly, like that acceptance cycle has happened numerous times. The process of identifying as disabled within the social model and feeling powerful and strong about that identity has only happened once. And it definitely gives me strength and information to draw on as my body or circumstances change. But I think we often think about access and accessibility, particularly within the sort of arts and cultural sector. I think organisations have a tendency to think about access as a task they complete, like we become accessible and then it's done, rather than the reality, which is the process of constantly identifying and removing disabling or other exclusionary barriers. So, and that people, disabled and neurodivergent people, don't exist in isolation. They are also Black and brown people. They are also women or people who identify in different ways. They are also working class people. They're also people who experience financial barriers. They're also people who have English as a second language. It's like there's loads of the sort of increasingly thinking about the intersectionality of people is really important, I think, for identifying those barriers and working to remove them. Biscuit, sausage.
Well, that you've worked beautifully into something I've just written down. So, because I just have a thought that we often separate difference, into these little sections, don't we, of like race, ability, and that isn't useful, is it? And I think when we talk about intersectionality, it's often used very much within, well, from my point of view, from feminism and race. But do you think that the arts and cultural sectors could do with thinking about difference more holistically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I think it's about understanding that we need to create spaces that are answerable to our communities, that are reflective and representative of our communities in their diversity, and that what happens is that there tends to be a sort of policing and a power, like you can use this space but only on the terms of the people who are in a position of privilege within that organization. So what we're talking about is redistribution of power and redistribution of opportunity, and I think that will make some organizations uncomfortable. I think it's important to acknowledge that when I talk about disability, the opposite of that is not ability. I don't see, for me, disabled doesn't mean less able, and I don't talk about like different abilities, because that seems like, that feels like of course we all have different strengths and abilities. What happens to disabled people is that their bodies and minds are systematically excluded, either through a lack of thought or through the sort of impact of assumption, discomfort, prioritizing bodies that are the sort of normative expectation. So I suppose for me, I'm quite careful about not using ability, because I think that buys into a sort of medical and charity model. It puts emphasis back on individuals. We're not talking about individuals with varied abilities. We're talking about making a world that is shaped for us all, and that is where access isn't a gift that we give. It's not a nice act. It's an equal, like we need to understand that we need to create equal systems. And that doesn't mean everybody doing things in the same way, because all of our bodies do work in different ways, and we need different things. Attention and focus doesn't look the same for every body and mind. Communication and sort of expressions of sort of friendship don't look the same for every body and mind. And similarly, the way that we make art will be different. But in that difference, I think that's where, like, creatively and socially, it feels really exciting.
And I think it's quite difficult it can be challenging as a disabled person to say that you are disabled. I sometimes feel like, like back in the 18th century when there were a few famous women who dressed as men in order to have a career, because you weren't allowed to have a career unless you looked like, a guy. And so they would sort of dress up, and there was a few sort of female pirates and things, who would wear trousers and look like a guy. And I kind of feel a bit like that, because I dress up as a normal person in order to kind of be, and I don't mean dress up in clothes here, I mean dress up in terms of covering up my neurodivergency constantly, paddling like a swan with my legs under the water, going, I don't know what anybody's talking about, oh my God. I'm not quite sure I got the hang of this conversation, or whatever it is. And so I think it's actually quite difficult. I think people forget that disabled people also, in a way, kind of disable themselves, because sometimes it's really hard to get out in the world and go, oh, well, this is what I am, and take me or leave me.
Yeah, I think that there is still an inherent idea that to be disabled is bad and is tragic, and disability is a sort of dirty word and something that, of course, you wouldn't want to say about yourself. For me, it's acknowledging barriers. It's not saying there's anything. It doesn't really say anything about me. It says something about my experience in the world. And I think that often there's this perception that disability is a club and that you have to hit a certain severity to call yourself disabled. It's not like, and I think that we're really moving away from that idea, and I think that's great, because if you experience barriers because of how your body or mind works, you can choose to identify as disabled if you wish. You can also choose not to identify in that way. But for me, I think it's important to say that I'm disabled and that I'm proud, because it makes myself visible to other people, to other disabled neurodivergent people. It means that it for me, acknowledges those barriers. And if we don't acknowledge those barriers, then we can't expect them to be changed.
That's true, but don't you feel professionally that it can be challenging? Because if I reach out to an organization, I'm currently working with a particular organization at the moment, not BOM, and where I feel I've been quite honest and open about my real self, but it also feels really uncomfortable, because I it's very hard to describe, isn't it? But I think when you are neurodivergent particularly, there's a worry that you will be infantilized, you will be seen as having less skills and capabilities than you actually do, professionally I'm talking about now, and that there might be opportunities available to you through, maybe they have a disability, call out that you can jump on, but trying to get any of the other general opportunities might be more challenging because you need extra help. I mean, I'm sure people outside of the arts organizations feel this as well, where you apply for a job and you're supposed to tell people you've got a disability at the interview, but I wonder how many people feel comfortable enough to be able to do that, or just think, oh, I'm going to not get the job if I do open up to who I am.
And of course that there are risks associated with that, and it is exposing to say what you require and to be open about what you require. Of course that can feel exposing, and I haven't got to this point like overnight. I haven't always felt confident and comfortable talking about my impairments, or like describing what access requirements I need. I think it's important to say that disabled and neurodivergent people will have, many of us will have lots of internalized ableist ideas, and we will have them because we will have them because we are often being raised by non-disabled parents and families. So, and I think it's, so even if I think that there are some differences between people who are born with their impairments and some people who acquire them, but actually really the main difference is at what point you have to face your own internalized ideas. Our environments and systems send us messages all the time, and often if you're a disabled or neurodivergent person, the messages that you are getting are, you are not valued, you're not thought about, you have to change yourself in order to access and fit in with our rules and expectations. I don't think that going along with that process is in the long-term interests of disabled neurodiverse people. I think it damages our well-being. I think it means that we can't be our authentic selves, and it means that generations coming up behind us don't see themselves represented in their beautiful diversity and authenticness. So I think that there is I feel a responsibility to do some of that work on myself, to feel that I can then expose myself and say what I require, on the understanding that if I don't get that opportunity or that job, then actually I wouldn't have been able to do the best possible job, because I wouldn't have had what I needed to do that. If I get opportunities, then I get them on my terms, and therefore I then have the support and understanding I need to do a really thorough job and to create something that then hopefully helps open up opportunities for other people coming after me.
That's why you're a superhero. You get this, because it's, you know, I definitely have grown up with those ableist ideas, and was quite devastated, is the honest word to use, when I found out that I was autistic, which didn't happen until I was 47. So I only had 10 years to get used to this brain, which is weird, because before that I just thought I was mad, you know, like as if being mad was somehow kind of better than being autistic, which is ridiculous. So yeah, this is why I want to have these conversations with people. This is why I really love being part of this this process that we're doing at BOM, talking to neurodivergent people, because for me it's like, I'm not learning from you, but I'm hearing what you're saying and hopefully calling out myself where I feel it. And I think that's really important work that we all need to do, whether we are disabled, whether we're not, whether we're an organization or not. It's akin to the conversations around racism, isn't it? And just accepting those places where, or just not accepting, noticing those places where we think racially, and then we need to just really work on that. And it's the same with this ableism, you know, that I think it is so embedded in our culture, and it's really, really helpful to have proper conversations about it like this, and be open and thoughtful about how we think about ourselves and the world.
It's understanding the sort of the systemic nature of it, and that it's not just like an issue that affects an individual. It's like every sort of structure within our society has it sort of threaded through it, and therefore we need to unpick that. I think that there is often this assumption that disabled people know what their access requirements are, that we like somehow like automatically know what we need. Actually, really, I've only learned what my access requirements are by having them well met. So in order to know what we need to experience good quality support. And similarly, we need sort of time and space and connectivity with other people to work out what we need. Everything useful, Biscuit, I have learned about being a disabled person, I have learned from other disabled people.
Yes.
Like literally, I can't think of a single thing that doesn't like have a huge impact in my day, every day for a positive, that hasn't come from other disabled people. And so that visibility and connectedness, and that was something that I've like, it's natural to feel resistant to that in the beginning, because it's natural to buy into those ideas of overcoming the sort of narratives that you have to that you have to have sort of special qualities to overcome your impairment, rather than to acknowledge that you are having to operate within systems and structures and environments that are systematically designed to exclude you and to make you feel and to problematize your body or your mind. And I think that there are different types of experience. I often feel lucky in a way, Biscuit, that I have tics that are really noticeable, so I don't have to think about when I disclose that to people. Biscuit, there's no choice. They often go in a room before me. And I'm a wheelchair user, so I have a physical, visible, very clearly understood example of impairment. So in lots of ways, I don't have the privilege of passing as non-disabled. The way my body or mind works stands out, and there are, and in some ways that means that I actually see that, like I often feel that is an advantage for me, because it means that I can't fall into those ideas of trying to conform and do things in a normative way. But it's not foolproof, because when a couple of years ago, Biscuit, I started experiencing increasing issues with chronic pain and energy. And I found it really difficult to adjust to that changing understanding of what my energy levels were, and what ideas around productivity, and feeling like I wasn't pulling my weight within the organization I work for. And then my colleague Matthew, who's very good at saying really insightful things that get into my brain, he said, well, we can take a socialist approach to energy, that we all put in the energy that we have and that we make things happen with that, rather than having to count like hours. And that was the start for me of understanding that expectations around energy, communication, sending emails at the middle of the night, all of those things that our cultural sector is built on, are also inherently ableist and exclusionary. And so that with the social model of disability, it's often really easy to explain it in the context of environmental and physical barriers. But it's really also important that we understand that those attitudinal barriers, or those systemic barriers, or the assumptions that we make, they are still social model issues, and that we need to make sure that you shouldn't have to give detailed personal medical history to access a service, or to feel like you feel safe in a cultural space. We should be making cultural spaces that expect disabled people, that expect neurodivergent people. I went to a comedy show a few years ago at Biscuit, and I hadn't done lots of the things that I would normally do in terms of introducing myself personally to the comedian at the start, and making sure that the theatre knew. Like, it was at Edinburgh, so it was more rushed. And the comedian sort of really focused on me and asked lots of questions, and it was quite an uncomfortable experience. But one thing he said that really stuck with me, he was like, oh, as a comedian, you plan for hecklers, you plan for hen parties, you plan for drunk people, but I've never planned for someone with Tourette's. Biscuit, why do we expect to go to the theatre or to a gallery and not sit next to someone with Tourette's syndrome or Down syndrome or dementia? Why are we expecting those people not to be in those creative and cultural spaces, when we understand that creativity has value for everybody? So I think that calling out and like understanding some of those inherent assumptions and the barriers that they create is the first part of making a creative sector that is more responsive to us all.
And I would personally like to see organisations make it such an integral part of the way that they operate. One of the examples I have is this idea of the quiet hours in supermarkets for people who have sensory issues, which I do, and for me, shopping in a lot of shops is completely impossible. It means then that when they have 1 hour a week available for people to use the supermarket, you get 52 hours potential supermarket use a year. Whereas for normal people, typical people without sensory issues, they have around 3,900 supermarket hours available to them a year. Like, 52 versus nearly 4,000 is really not good enough. And, you know, and I think that can be a problem with organizations sometimes, is that, well, you know, we have considered people with disabilities and with differences, and we've done this thing, like we've put in a ramp, but we haven't considered the lighting or the sound, or we're giving you 1 hour a week where it's a bit quieter. Why isn't it quieter all the time? Because it
yeah, or the classic we don't need disability equality training because we don't have any disabled people here, or like we don't need wheelchair access because we haven't got any wheelchair users who come. And it's like, yeah, maybe that's because you're not accessible. There's like loads of really ridiculous thinking around that. And I think that was, so, you know, I've sort of, lots of our work has advocated for relaxed performances, which is a way of describing performances that take a relaxed approach to sound or movement coming from the audience. But I got increasingly frustrated with, like, I don't want to have to go to a relaxed performance that's at a set time. I want choice in the range of performances that I go to. And I think that was I then started working with Battersea Arts Centre on the idea of a relaxed venue. What happens if we embed these principles within a venue and within everything that happens, you know, with everything that venue does? And I think embedded access and thinking about it from the start of processes is the most exciting version for me. And I think that like relaxed performances, for example, is an important step on the journey to creating spaces that work in a better way, but it's definitely not the destination. It definitely doesn't solve the issue for me. And I think that we've also got to be careful that it's very easy then to create sets of lists that people can use to say no to things. So I've certainly seen examples with relaxed performance of people being like, well, we can never do a loud show as a relaxed performance. We can never do a show that has sort of strong visual effect. Like the idea that we're starting to create rules that mean that we're excluding and saying no, rather than being like, all right, how do we make this work? What information do we need to tell people so that they can make choices about whether this is for them, or so that they can bring the right equipment to be able to enjoy this? I'm sensitive to sound, but that doesn't mean that I never want to see a loud show. I just need to know what to expect so that I can bring the right equipment, and that I know, like, also, you know, I know when to use it. The third Tourettes Hero director, Dr. Will Rennell, has done loads of amazing work, research around how sonic inclusion works and how sound includes and excludes people from spaces. And he's pioneered these amazing sonic stories, which basically map the sonic sensory landscape of a show, so that you can see when loud moments or quiet moments are going to happen, so and link that to sort of key narrative or key moments so that you can sort of see very visually what the sensory landscape looks like and how you then need to respond to it or prepare for it. There's some really exciting innovation that can happen as soon as we start allowing space for it to happen. And I suppose that won't happen if we don't start practicing pride. Stella Young, who's an amazing disabled activist from the States, who said from Australia, who sadly died, has an amazing TED talk on sort of inspiration porn, how disabled neurodiverse people. But she also talked a lot about practicing pride, and that you get proud practicing. And it took me a little while to understand that. But then it's like, yeah, I have to like call out my own ideas. I have to do things that are a bit uncomfortable sometimes, because I have the privilege of being like, I know that I have support structures and resilience and understanding that mean I can push myself sometimes to do things that are exposing, on the understanding that helps, that will help create more space for other people. And I think creating space and sharing opportunities is what I'm in, like, with like a very wide community, is what I'm interested in doing. It's not about like, my career aspirations aren't around achieving a certain thing for myself, but I would really like to see disability culture embedded and present in a much more deep-rooted way, so that people see themselves like reflected in cultural spaces and know that that's an option for them. For me, seeing disabled artists making challenging, provocative, funny work was an important part of feeling like that was something that I could do. And so I want to make that happen for more people and happen quicker, because it's like we're often, you know, I want disabled young people to be able to connect with ways of thinking that help them feel proud, and support them to practice being proud. And I think that and cultural spaces have a role to play within that, especially, you know, we're in a very uncertain time. We've had 10 years of austerity, which has massively impacted on disabled neurodivergent people and our sort of experiences and expectations. And COVID-19 risks making many people invisible again and rolling back lots of the positive change that has happened. I think we have to understand that we can't, that rather than using a sort of crisis as a reason to drop access, actually this is the opportunity for us to interrogate our practices and build a more inclusive world.
Yeah, it felt really exciting at the beginning for me personally, and I'm sure for other neurodivergent people, the fact that we could do things like this to talk to people on Zoom, because I find it quite difficult to be out in public spaces. So this felt really empowering to be able to do this. But I think the idea that we may kind of disappear again, I can see that beginning to happen already, and it's something I personally want to fight against, and I'm sure many of us do. But I want to ask you that question of pride, of neurodivergent pride or disabled pride, I think is a really important one. And we've been looking with these conversations about what organizations can do to make, you know, to make life better for all of us, really. So what do we offer as neurodivergent people? I want to hear, I always want to big us up, you know, like all the artists that we've spoken to, we've been showing their work as an integral part of these talks as well, because I think that's really important to see that the artists and the writers are artists and writers. They do this work. So I think that would be my last question I'd like you to think or talk about is what do you think we can offer? What do we do well, and what are we exceptional at?
Well,
and
I think
I say that's very difficult because it's a blanket term and all neurodivergent people are different, but give it a go.
I think that the lived experience of barriers and meaning that you have, meaning that anything that means that you sort of experience barriers in your life means that you are likely to I feel like disabled neurodivergent people are generally good at problem solving, creative thinking, and like innovation. I think rather than doing things in the way that sort of everyone's done them forever, I think that neurodiversity and disability culture offer real variety and innovation in terms of what stories are told and how they're told, and how how we use our how sensory information is communicated. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the creativity and new approaches that we bring to our methods of working, and often that come from places of real authenticity in terms of how we make work. I think it's important to understand that seeing the same work told in the same way is boring, and that that disabled people are part of audiences, that 1 in 5 people identify as disabled, and therefore it's not a niche issue. We're talking about huge part of the population who are also the audience and should also be the leaders as well as the artists. And I think often there's a pressure on disabled neurodivergent artists to make educative work, to make work that educates about our experience. And I am excited to see that. I feel like we're moving beyond that a lot, and understanding, I'm interested in making work that is primarily for a disabled neurodiverse audience first. Obviously neurotypical non-disabled people can participate in that, but they're not necessarily the people that I'm speaking to first. So that educative model I'm keen to sort of smash about a bit. And you know, of course, disabled artists don't need to make work about disability and or neurodivergence, but the way that we will, those things are inherent to our being and our identity and who we are, so they will influence our practice and how we practice. And I think that that then has the potential to inject energy and innovation to a sector that actually is has a real risk of becoming stale if it just holds on and tries to replicate things that have been successful in the past. So culture needs to evolve with our with us, and that disabled people are an important part of that. And I think embedding it, so it, like, we have to move away from this idea that it's a gift, that it's a nice thing to do for someone, that we do like. And I think that the sort of sensory shopping hours you talk about fall into that charity model, like, or risk falling into that charity model. It's like, we do this nice thing for this group of people and then we don't have to think about it again. Whereas rather that we really need to understand that it is our shared responsibility of everyone who's making or enjoying art to think about making sure that those opportunities that we value are available and reflective of our communities. Because otherwise, what's the point?
Absolutely.
Fact.
God, I love talking to you.
I love talking to you. Thank you so much. There's something just so brilliant about conversations between disabled people. And I think often we're expected to speak outwards. We're expected to speak out to non-disabled people. Actually, connecting together and connecting across borders, I think really at the moment as well, is really important. So it's very easy for the politics of where you live. I've been, we've toured work internationally, and I'm really lucky that that's meant that we've got to sort of talk to disabled people all over the world. And it helped me realize that the politics of place, of where you live, can really impact and define the expectations and aspirations of disabled people. So I think it's important that we have conversations about justice, culture and rights across borders.
It's interesting you should say that, because one of the things I wanted to do in this series was to just have a roundtable discussion around Zoom discussion, just with neurodivergent people. It felt, I didn't do it in the end because I wasn't quite sure if that wouldn't begin to drift into this area of being peered at, like as we're having a discussion together. And I think it is a really hard, it's a difficult thing to put in the world, because I think that's really important, that neurodivergent people get together and talk to each other, and that can be seen that this is how we communicate, and it's empathic, and it's loving, and it's exciting, and it's creative, and it's political, and it's all those things, this media promotion of what a neurodivergent, a bit, in my case particularly autistic people is quite tedious, because we aren't the way that we're portrayed, really, all of us. So it's really interesting that you say that, and I love being able to have these ones, but I would really love to see more conversations happening neurodivergent to neurodivergent, and
I think it is a balance, because but I think what those conversations do, like if I'm being interviewed by a disabled person, it just cuts away a lot of the shit instantly. Like it cuts a lot away, like lots of the sort of explanation that needs to happen just falls away, and you can get to a truth more quickly. And I think it's also important for solidarity and safety that we have those spaces, that we're able to talk about those issues without worrying about politeness and without that feeling exposing in a particular way in terms of the sort of power balances. So I think that there are real places for those types of connection and connectivity between people. It's also important that, I think that there is understandably a anxiety, given the history of disabled people being institutionalized, shut away, like not visible, and our art being only seen in the context of sort of therapeutic and like, and I think that that is less of a problem in the UK than it is in other parts of the world. I think we're that was an issue like 10 years ago in terms of, or 20 years ago in terms of like disabled people's work only being seen in the context of community and not being seen as high quality practice. I think that that's changed, and I think that there's been I think that the investment from Arts Council over the last decade has been meaningful in lots of ways. There's still lots of room for that to change, and I'm uncertain about this next bit of time. But I think that in other parts of the world, that idea that somehow if work is by disabled or neurodivergent people, then somehow it's inherently of a lesser quality is rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. And I think that just needs to be just that. So I understand that there's an anxiety about like being pigeonholed potentially, or being restricted in terms of sort of people's understanding of your practice. But it's also important for us to connect and challenge each other so that we're not making work that plays into those stereotypes, or that plays in like that we as artists feel that we're able to make the sort of fullest versions of our work that we want to achieve, and that we're not capping our own ambition.
It's a hard road to walk.
It is, but I'm definitely glad. I'm definitely glad I'm on this road and not the neurotypical road.
Me too. Yeah, me too.